Episode 3 of Parenthood is called Grasslands, and here we open up in the African plains and we see a family zebra, and then we see them getting attacked by wild dogs. Now what's interesting about this is that when they're getting chased, the male actually splits off and diverts the attention to him, so the dogs end up following him instead of his family. That's really interesting, not something I would have expected. It does kind of make sense because stallions do have a harem, so all the foals are realistically going to be his, so I guess it's in his best interest to make sure they survive. But that's a very interesting behaviour that I would never have thought about, and the fact that we don't really get any more of that sequence is quite short. It makes me think that the male probably did die and they didn't want to show it. Very interesting start of the episode, an interesting behaviour, not something I've seen before, not something I've really heard of before. And to be honest with you, I could have gone for more of it. To be honest, I could have gone for a longer sequence there, but still really interesting. And then we go to America. Here we see the Sand Joaquin kit fox, I think it's called. This type of fox lives in the desert. Because there's been a lot of rain, the vegetation's in bloom, loads of vegetation. You'd normally think that's a good thing with it being the desert. However, these foxes hunt kangaroo rats at night, and because the vegetation's so dense, it's actually harder to find their prey. Not great for them. Also, back at the den, the kits are playing about. However, this newfound vegetation is great cover for coyotes. And this was quite a good sequence. Actually, at the start, I was kind of like, okay, it's going to be a bit cutesy. I'm not really going to care. By the end, I was actually quite invested. And the mum manages to come back and you think, okay, maybe they're safe. But the coyote is still hiding. You see it. We know the foxes don't see it, but we do. And it gets out and manages to get one of the kits and runs off with it. It's actually quite a good sequence. I was actually quite impressed because I was kind of complaining about the last two episodes. Not really showing enough. Not really showing you any real peril. It's probably less disturbing for kids to watch a young fox getting taken by a coyote in the dark as opposed to the day, where it's a much clearer image. So I actually did respect them for that. I really liked that sequence. It was a very interesting one. It did make me feel something. I was very much on the edge of my seat when the coyote was nearby, and I ended up really caring. I didn't expect that at the start of the sequence, so yeah, it was really good. It was a really strong start to the episode. And then we go to the British countryside. Here we see the potter wasp makes a little nest for its grub, hence why it got its name, and it stuffs it with caterpillars, but we see it's actually quite a struggle to get the caterpillars in. The caterpillars' life cycle is obviously fluctuating. They've got to try and keep up with them, and if they get too big, they're not going to be able to fit them in the hole that leads to the nest. So that was really good. It was an interesting side of that because you don't usually see wasps being portrayed as sympathetically. They're almost always the villain. Them and orcas are pretty much the most vilified animals in these programs, I think. And the fact that it's just harvesting of these caterpillars would normally be seen as, a bad thing. But here you do see the wasp's perspective, and I quite like that as well. And it's got a little sad ending when we talk about how the wasp's going to die soon, and it's never going to see its grub. It was surprisingly emotional for a sequence about wasps. Then we see cheetahs. So then cheetah stuff was interesting. We see a mother cheetah and her cubs, and they're kind of playing about. They're at the point where they're kind of getting ready to join the hunt, but they're not really experienced enough, so they're going to be absolutely no use to her. So what she does is she finds a newborn gazelle, and this is something I've heard of before. I was aware of this, and I was quite excited to see it because I didn't really think I'd ever see that. It's quite a dark, twisted kind of behaviour, whereby the cheetahs will essentially take a young animal, usually a gazelle, and basically hand it over to their cubs, so the cubs can kind of play hunt it. So it's essentially torture for the gazelle, but it's a very useful tool for our cubs. And it is really interesting seeing that. They kind of showed as much as they could. I feel like as that sequence went on, the gazelle probably, would have died eventually, and probably not in a very nice way. But I think it was very good that they showed that, and it is a very interesting behaviour, and I hadn't seen before, so yeah, I was quite happy with that. Then we see the cubs using what they've learned to join their mum in a hunt. The whole sequence with the cheetahs was pretty good. I really enjoyed it, and it was stuff I hadn't really seen before, so I was really interested in that. Then we go to Mongolia, and here we see demoiselle cranes. I feel like demoiselle cranes are always great in these series. Since Planet Earth, whenever they've popped up in something, I've been like, yeah, cool, let's see more of them. And here we see they're nested on the Mongolian plains. It's all good, they've got their nest. And then we see loads of sheep come in. Now, I think that sheep are actually a big problem for nesting birds, probably across the world. There's a lot of sheep in the world, so I think it is actually quite interesting that they did highlight that. And then the sheep are getting a bit too close to them, so they're trying to scare them away. But obviously, a crane versus a sheep, the sheep's probably going to win. And then, in almost like soap opera fashion, the eggs start hatching, which really kicks the parents into gear to kind of, kick the sheep away. That was a really good sequence. Again, another demoiselle crane sequence that really landed for me. It had a lot of tension, and yeah, it was pretty cool. And then we see the African wild dogs again. We see this massive family. They've managed to raise all these cubs up to sort of their teenage years. But like the cheetahs, they're not really useful in a hunt yet, so the adults are leading them off to hunt buffalo, which is, not the easiest thing to take on. I feel like they could have started them in like, a wildebeest or an impala or something. And the teenagers are basically left to do it themselves. And this is a really good sequence because the shots are amazing. All the drone footage of the buffaloes and the wild dogs, it's pretty spectacular. There's more than a couple shots that are just pretty gorgeous. And obviously the teenagers fail, so the adults have got, step in and help them out. The teenagers are kind of taking on the biggest buffalo there, whereas the adults are like, no, let's go for a calf. And they still aren't able to get it, which is kind of rare for these sequences because almost always in these things, you tend to see African wild dogs succeeding in a hunt. But I'm glad they didn't because it was a change of pace. And also it is buffalo, so, it's pretty pretty much the hardest thing they're going to tackle realistically. Then we go to India, and here we follow a mother, Hanuman Langar. She's recently given birth to her baby. Before the baby's born, we see her kind of learning how to be a mother by grooming other young monkeys. So that was quite interesting. But then we see them all getting attacked by feral dogs, which is really interesting again. I feel like there isn't a massive push for environmental stuff in this episode, but this is a kind of subtle nod because ultimately, if it wasn't for us, these feral dogs wouldn't be here and the monkeys would probably be fine, or at least they'd have more natural predators. Watching them get away from the dogs as well was really good because at the start of that sequence I was like, okay, cool, these monkey sequences, I'm never that invested. I was more invested than I normally was. It did end happily, obviously. The monkeys aren't going to get killed by dogs. We're not going to show that. But, you know, it was pretty good as well. I think that was a really good sequence that had some tension. And then we go to the sociable weavers in Africa. Now, you don't see weaver birds that often, at least not as the focus, but they build the largest nest structures in the animal kingdom. It is a pretty impressive structure. You do get a sense of how big it is, the scale of it, how hard it is to build. I think they did a good job of highlighting that. And we see them chasing away snakes. You see this proper cooperation within the community. They're not all related, but they all work together to get rid of snakes. It does feel like a team effort, not just building the structure, but also defending it. That was good. However, when it heats up, that all kind of goes to pot. It kind of becomes Lord of the Flies. All the weaver birds are too hot. They're not even defending their nests. And what actually was surprising about that was that the adults will actually go into other birds' nests, like their neighbours' nests, and just throw their chicks out. No one really seems to know why. There's no explanation given. But it was a really fascinating behaviour, and it's really dark. This episode definitely was a lot darker than the other ones. I feel like I was kind of complaining a bit that they were kind of cutting away from things too often. This one didn't really do that. There was a lot of stuff in here that was, you know, quite hard to watch, I would say, certainly if you were a younger audience. And it was a really good sequence, and the fact that it's so mysterious and we don't really know why, we just know that their society basically breaks down when it gets too hot. I think it does a good job of highlighting that even though we kind of think we understand the impacts of climate change, even though we really don't, this sequence really highlighted that all these really surprising things could happen, to things we wouldn't even imagine. The last major bit of footage we get is guanaco, which weren't an obvious one because we only ever see guanaco getting hunted by pumas normally, but this was a very interesting sequence as well. We saw these guanaco, they're up on the high plains, but because winter's coming, they've got to get to lower ground, which means crossing fences. Now this was interesting because I've seen this before in other species, namely the Mongolian gazelle in Asia, I think that was the most recent one. But this was pretty similar. We basically see the adults are able to jump over the fences, however the young, not as strong, so they kind of get caught. We see some of them in pretty bad shape. We one that's got like a massive cut in its leg, and that looks like it's probably going to become infected. We see that some of them die. There's this almost like a mass graveyard of guanaco at this point. Like, it's really, really horrible. And we follow this one mother and her calf. She's able to get over, but the calf isn't. So she then goes back over to the other side and goes the long way around with her calf. That was really good, really emotional. And yeah, I did have a happy ending, but it obviously does highlight that this is a real problem. I really liked that as well, and it was a really good end to the episode. Then we get the diaries, and it's all about the guanaco. It's not really about the filming, it's all about the conservation. Again, that's been a theme throughout this series, and I quite like it. It was interesting learning that a lot of these fences don't even need to be there. They're from ranches that were abandoned like 40 years ago. So the fact that they're still there anyway is just pointless. So all this damage and death they're causing to the guanaco is completely pointless. So we watch the people taking the fences down. That's good. That was a really good sequence as well, and another good way of ending the episode. So yeah, this episode, as you can tell, I really liked. I thought it was the best one so far of the series by a mile. Really good stuff. I liked pretty much everything. The highlights, probably the social weavers, the African wild dogs, the cheetahs, the demoiselle cranes, kind of everything in here was pretty good. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you thought of this episode. What were your highlights? Did you agree with me? Is this your favourite episode of the series so far as well? Let me know in the comments below. I'll be doing the next one next week, which is all about freshwater, so look forward to that. And as ever, feel free to like, comment and subscribe, or don't if you don't want to. I'll survive if you don't. And yeah, I'll see you next time, and goodbye.